Welcome to the Daily Plunge. We're in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, verses 23 through 31. Now, we're doing the 12 days of Christmas, and we're looking at these passages in light of the incarnation, the nativity of Christ. And Christmas is the fruition of the Old Testament, which is what the author of Hebrews is talking about in chapter 11. Now, the foundation of this is what comes out in verse 1, that faith is the certainty of God's promises, that we are assured of our hope. And so in verse 23, it says that the parents of Moses acted in faith, that they trusted God when the government wanted to solve a problem by executing all the male babies, right? They defied the government at great personal risk to risk to the whole family, trusting that God had a promise for Moses. And then Moses, even though he was raised in wealth and privilege in the Pharaoh's household, right? He accepted mistreatment, right? He acted by faith. In fact, it says that he regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ of greater value than the treasures of heaven, right? But greater than the fleeting, sinful pleasures of this world. Now, how is it that Moses knows about Christ, right? Because there's barely any messianic prophecies, to this point. There's a few here and there, but it's not a big theme. Well, let's go back to Hebrews chapter 1 and think about how Jesus Christ, God has spoken through his Son. And so his Son, Jesus Christ, is the Word, and that Word is the promise of God. And so even though Moses may not know the fullness of the prophecy of the Messiah, he knows God's promise of his Word. And he trusts that Word greater than the fleeting pleasures of Egypt. He goes on that in he kept the faith, in the Passover, the application of blood, right? So that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. And we know how this is it foretells the coming of the Lamb of God who will cover all of God's people with his blood so that we will not be destroyed by Satan. And then verse 29, by faith the people passed through the dry land and the Red Sea. And again, it sort of challenges us. Do we trust God and his promises more than what we see with our eyes, what we think with our brains? We are limited. And the incarnation may not make sense to the world, but that's because they don't have the eyes of faith. And actually, their vision, their understanding is limited. And then he goes on about how the walls of Jericho fell. That an army marched around it for 7 days. An army of what? An army of worshipers. For 7 days, they were praying and singing praises to God. And then the walls fell down. And then at the end, we hear about Rahab, this prostitute, this somebody who is supposed to be outside the promises of God, but she welcomed the promise of God's people coming, right? And so she was seen as somebody who trusted God rather than the disobedient. Well, thanks, friends. Have a blessed day.